The definition of the word tragedy in the Oxford Language Dictionary says this: an event causing great suffering, destruction, and distress, such as a serious accident, crime, or natural catastrophe. We have families in our community who experienced a tragedy Friday evening. Hunter Reedy was shot and killed. And Michael, I say that, Fedorchuk, was shot and wounded. Both of these families have experienced a tragedy. And so I thought about that. And do you know, there are a lot of people who experience tragedy. I want to just look at some observations concerning tragedy. And then I got to close because we got to do the whatever it's called, bylaw thing. So here's the first thing I want you to see about tragedy. God does not cause people to commit destructive acts that cause tragedy in the lives of others. A lot of times when something bad happens like this, I hear people say in 40-some years of ministry, why did God do this? And if I get the opportunity to do it tactfully, I say God didn't have anything to do with it. God had nothing to do with what happened Friday evening. Why? Well, this is the second thing I want you to see, is that God allows people to make choices, good or bad. If God did not limit His power, we would all be robots. He is omnipotent, all-powerful, but He limits His power, so you have the free will to choose on your own. Now, who messed that up right off the bat? Adam and Eve. They chose the wrong thing. And ever since then, that's what we as human beings have been doing. I forget how many rules and laws the Congress of the United States has passed. But it's thousands of them on the books now. And people who were put in a garden where everything was perfect couldn't keep one because of a bad choice, a bad decision. And so when God created us, He created us in His image, which was the ability to choose, to have an intellect and a volition of our own. And so we should not say, why did God do this? God didn't. But He created us to be like Him, which gives us the ability to choose, and a lot of times people do not choose the right thing or the best thing. And that's why things of this nature happens. A tragedy in a person's life caused by an outside force is not God's punishment for doing something wrong. How many of you have ever had something happen to you, not to the magnitude that happened Friday, but how many of you have had something bad in your life happen, and the first thing you think of is, what did I do? Have you ever thought that way? What did I do that this happened? Do you know if God punished us every time we did something wrong, Blake would have made it to about 12 and a half. God does not punish us every time we do something wrong. And when something bad happens, it's not because we've done something wrong. Now, there are always consequences to our choices, good or bad. But that is not God sending something bad your way. It's just a consequence of your action or my action. How many of you have read the book of Job? Have you read that book? Well, some really bad things happened to him. And do you know what? It wasn't because he had done something wrong. The reason the bad things happened to him is because he did everything right. That's amazing, isn't it? Chapter 1, verse 8 says this. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. In verse 22, after he had lost all his possessions, his children, he lost everything but a nagging wife. I'm just saying. Yeah, it's in the Bible. In all of that, look at verse 22. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And so then what does Satan do? He comes back around when the angels come into God's presence. God said, where have you been? He said, I've been out roaming the earth. He said, well, have you considered my servant Job? I allowed you to take all this from him, and he still has held his integrity. What'd Satan say? Well, you know, it's one thing to lose your possessions or your relatives, but if you will let me just touch him physically, then you'll see what Job will do. He will curse you. And so God said, well, go ahead. But you cannot take his life. And what did Satan do to Job? Go ahead, somebody tell me. What happened to him? Yeah, he had these sores from the top of his head to the sole of his feet. And the Bible says that he would take broken pottery and scrape those things. And it also said that there were scabs and worms in it. I mean, terrible. But he remained faithful to God. Now, here's another thing that I want you to see is that a person rarely knows when tragedy is going to strike. Rarely do we know when it's going to happen. Barbara Delp had invited some of us over to her house to have supper Friday evening, and I don't know if it's on Marilyn's phone or whose phone that this tragedy had happened. And you know what? Job didn't have a clue that it was going to happen in his life. The last part of verse 12 says, then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were ploughing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who is left who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, while Job was getting that bad news, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you. Let me just pause there a minute. It was not the fire of God. Whose fire was it? It was the fire of Satan. God did not do that. Satan did, but God had to limit himself in order for Satan to do it. The fire of God fell from the sky, burned up the sheep and the servants. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking. Don't you think Job thought, can it get any worse? Do you think he thought that? And then, while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job got up that morning just like every morning and had no clue what he was about to face. And that's the way it happens most of the time in our lives when tragedy strikes. The next thing I want you to see about it is that all tragic events cause suffering and grief. Now remember, Job lost all of his possessions, all of his relatives. And then God allowed Satan to strike his body. And verse 7 and 8, I don't have that here. I didn't give that to Kim, but it says, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery, scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His friends came to see him in chapter 2, verse. I want to start with verse 12. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. How many of us, when we go visit somebody who has suffered a loss in their family or some tragic event, we think we've got to say something? And you know, a lot of times I tell people, whether it's other younger preachers or even just people from the church, you don't always have to say something. When people have experienced something of the magnitude that these 2 families did Friday, they just need somebody to come and sit. They don't need any Bible verses quoted to them at that time. How many of y'all remember Charlie Donald? You remember Charlie? He and Blake are first cousins. Charlie's oldest daughter, Amanda, was born with a bad valve in her heart. And I think before she was 3, she'd had 2 surgeries. Is that right, Doug? I know she'd had 2 surgeries. Yeah. And it was up in Baltimore for one of them, I know. Boston. And Charlie's best friend in the world, Ray, who was in the insurance business with him, was up there for the second surgery. And Charlie was at his wit's end after the first one. And something wasn't going right with the second one. And Ray started to quote a scripture verse, and Charlie just went off on it. He said, I don't want to hear any more of that. Now later, he apologized. But you know what? Most of us, we're not like Job. When all this happened to Job, he said in chapter 1, when the first thing happened, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. As a matter of fact, the verse before that says, at this Job got up and tore his robe, shaved his head, then he fell to the ground in worship. After he'd lost 10 kids and every possession he had. But how did he react when the sores came? Verse 9, chapter 2. His wife said to him, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. He replied, you're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So, and I don't got time to go into it right now, but when his friends did speak, it was not the right thing. And instead of Job being comforted, he was irritated. So I'm just saying, sometimes words are not necessary. Just your presence. So think about that. And if you are going to speak, pray and ask God to give you wisdom before you speak. Now, the next thing I want you to see is that bad things happen to bad people and good people. Tragedy does not just come to bad people. It comes to everybody. Just like I said, Job was the most righteous man on earth when this happened to him. And so he said this, man born of woman, in chapter 14, verse 1 and 2, man born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. He springs up like a flower and withers away like a fleeting shadow. He does not endure. How many of you have ever had a really bad week? You ever had a really bad week? Not just a bad day, a really bad week. Or maybe a month. Or longer. You see, in America, we think if we live right and we go to church and we tithe and we smile and we do all the right things and we check off all the right boxes, that God is not going to let anything bad happen to us. That is nowhere in the Bible. He allowed His own Son to be crucified, to die an agonizing death. I don't know where we got the idea that nothing bad would ever happen to us. As a matter of fact, in John 16:33, Jesus said this, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you what? 3 words. Will have trouble. You will have trouble. But be of good cheer, because I have overcome the world. If you live long enough, you're going to experience trouble. It is just part of the human experience. And so, when it happens, don't say, God, why did you do this? You see, most of the time when a hurricane comes or a tornado comes or a flood or a fire, we say it's an act of God. Well, in Job's case, it was an act of Satan. I think we attribute a lot of stuff to God that's not God. And so, we just need to think. So I want to close with this. What is our response to people who are suffering a tragedy in their life? What is your response? What is my response when that happens? What should we do? Well, you know, I really was supposed to preach from Colossians today. And, but I thought I ought to address what had happened in our community. But then I read one of the verses that I was going to talk about today. And it's Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. When I read that last word, patience, I thought about Charlie scolding Ray when he wanted to talk to him about God. Ray was patient. He didn't lash back out at Charlie. As a matter of fact, they were friends till Ray died. Because Ray practiced patience with Charlie. So, we, as a body of believers, need to ask ourselves, how can we be compassionate? How can we be kind? How can we be gentle? Not just with these families who are suffering in this tragedy, but at any time. So I want to close with this from the last chapter in the book of Job. If there's one thing I've learned from the book of Job is this. Number one, on this side of heaven, you're never fully going to understand suffering. We're never going to fully understand it. But what we can do, what the book of Job teaches us, is that we can trust God in our suffering. That's what Job did. Did he want to question God? Yes. And some of you wanted to question God, then you say, oh no, God, I didn't mean that. Do you know what? God is secure enough in who He is, you can question Him. People who don't want to be questioned are insecure in what they believe. God has got it. But do you know what? In chapter 42, verse 10, after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord made him prosperous again and gave him how much? Twice as much as he had before. Twice as much as he had before. I do know what some of you have been through in life. I don't know what others of you have been through. But I do know this. God's promises of better and peace are more in the life to come than they are in this one. It's tough sometimes to look at where we are and to see beyond that. But we all need to learn to do that. Everything under the new covenant that Jesus brought is better than what was under the old covenant. If you read the book of Hebrews, that word better is the key word in the whole book. We have everything better under the new covenant. So, no matter what happens, you're still going to grieve. You're still going to be upset. You're still going to wonder why. But never lose your trust in God. And you're still going to experience all the emotions. But God will bring you through it.